There is a small town in the hills of northern Italy called Montefiore, where the mornings smell of pine and old stone, and the bells of the local church ring exactly 7 times at dawn. It is the kind of place where nothing changes quickly, where the same families have lived for generations, and where everyone knows the name of every person who walks through the market square on a Saturday. Life in Montefiore moves slowly and deliberately, and the people there have always taken a certain pride in that stillness. Sister Cristina Scuccia had lived in that town for most of her life. She was born not far from there, the youngest of 4 children in a family that worked the land and attended Mass every Sunday without fail. From the time she was very small, people noticed that she had something different about her. She was quiet in a way that was not shy but thoughtful, and she listened more than she spoke. Her mother always said that Cristina was paying attention to something the rest of them could not hear. At 7 years old, she began singing in the church choir, and the choirmaster, an old man with a thick white beard and serious eyes, told her parents after the first rehearsal that their daughter had a gift. He did not say it lightly. He said it the way a doctor delivers news that changes everything. But life does not always follow the path of a gift. Cristina grew up, finished school, and felt something pulling at her that she could not name for a long time. She had friends who married young, friends who moved to the cities, friends who built ordinary lives with ordinary rhythms. She did not feel superior to any of them. She simply felt called in a different direction. At 19, she entered the Ursuline Sisters of the Holy Family and began her life as a nun. The music did not leave her. She sang in the convent chapel every morning and every evening, and the sisters around her would sometimes pause what they were doing just to listen. It was not a performance. It was simply something that happened when she opened her mouth. The years passed the way years do in a quiet place. She taught children in the parish school, she visited the sick, she prayed, she worked, and she aged with a gentleness that people remarked on when they saw her. By the time she was in her early 60s, her hair was completely silver, and her face held the kind of lines that only come from decades of honest living. She was not famous. She was not looking to be. She was known in her community as a woman of deep faith and warm presence, the kind of person you sought out when you needed calm, not spectacle. It was one of the younger sisters at the convent who first heard about the television program. Italy had its version of a singing competition show, the kind that had become popular around the world, where ordinary people stood in front of judges who sat in large red chairs with their backs turned to the stage. The judges could not see who was singing, they could only listen. If they liked what they heard, they pressed a button and turned around. If none of them turned, the singer walked away. The show was called The Voice, and it had already produced moments of surprise and emotion in several countries. Now it was in Italy, and it was drawing enormous audiences. The young sister watched clips of the Italian version on a small tablet and came to Sister Cristina one afternoon with a kind of nervous excitement. She showed her the program and suggested, in a voice that was almost apologetic, that perhaps Sister Cristina might consider auditioning. The older woman looked at the screen for a long moment and said nothing. Then she smiled the way she always smiled, with her whole face, and shook her head gently. She told the younger sister that she appreciated the thought, but that she was not the kind of person those programs were looking for. She was 63 years old. She wore the habit of a religious sister. She had never performed on a stage in her life. But the young sister was persistent, and so were 2 others who joined the conversation over the following weeks. They were not pushing her toward fame. They were pushing her toward something they believed she owed the world, or perhaps owed herself. They had heard her sing every day for years. They knew what she carried in her voice. They said very simply that it would be a shame for something that beautiful to stay only inside the walls of the convent. Sister Cristina prayed about it. She was not a dramatic person, and she did not make decisions quickly. She asked herself honestly what her motivation would be and whether it aligned with the life she had chosen. She spoke with her superior, who listened carefully and told her that faith does not require hiding. She thought about the children she had taught over the years, and what it might mean for them to see someone like her step into an unfamiliar room and simply be herself without apology. In the spring of that year, she filled out the application form with careful handwriting and sent it in. She did not tell many people. She continued her work, her prayer, her singing in the chapel. She waited. When the letter came saying she had been accepted to audition, she read it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it inside her Bible. Then she went to evening prayers with the rest of the sisters, and she sang, the way she always had, as if the room were full and as if the room were empty at the same time. The morning Sister Cristina left for Milan was ordinary in every way except one. The sky was the pale gray of early spring, and the air still carried the bite of winter that had not quite decided to leave. She packed a small bag the night before, the same kind of bag she would pack for any brief trip away from the convent, with only what she needed and nothing more. One of the younger sisters had ironed her habit carefully and left it folded on the chair by her door. Another had set a cup of warm milk and bread on the small table in the hallway before she was even awake. These were small gestures, but Sister Christina noticed each one and carried them with her the way you carry something precious in your coat pocket. The drive to Milan took several hours. She traveled with Sister Maria, one of the community's older members who had agreed to accompany her, and a representative from the show's production team who had been assigned to escort her from the moment she arrived in the city. The production man was young, polite, and clearly unsure how to behave around a nun. He opened every door for her and spoke in the careful tone people sometimes use when they are trying not to say the wrong thing. Sister Christina put him at ease within the first 20 minutes of the drive simply by asking him about his family and listening with genuine interest to his answers. By the time they reached the outskirts of Milan, he was laughing comfortably and telling her about his mother's cooking. Milan received her the way large cities receive quiet people, with noise and speed and indifference. The production studio was in a part of the city that felt entirely removed from anything she had known in Montefiore. There were large trucks parked outside the building, thick cables running across the ground, crew members in headsets moving in every direction with the focused urgency of people who operate on tight schedules. Sister Christina walked through all of it with the same steady pace she used when walking to the chapel in the mornings. She was not performing calm. She simply was calm, and people around her seemed to notice it the way you notice when a room suddenly becomes warmer. Inside the building, she was taken to a waiting area where other contestants sat in various states of nervousness. Some were young, barely out of their teenage years, with the particular energy of people who have wanted something for a long time and are now terrifyingly close to it. Others were older, carrying the kind of hope that has already survived a few disappointments and is therefore quieter but no less real. When Sister Christina entered the room in her full habit, conversation stopped for a brief moment. Then people recovered and smiled, and a few came forward to introduce themselves. She shook hands warmly, learned names, and sat down in a chair near the corner where she could see the whole room. A production assistant came by with a clipboard and asked her a series of questions for the show's records. What was her name? How old was she? Where was she from? Had she performed professionally before? When she answered that she was a nun and that she had never performed on a stage, the assistant paused with her pen hovering and looked up. Sister Christina met her eyes and waited. The assistant wrote down the answers without comment, but as she walked away, she looked back once with an expression that was hard to read, somewhere between curiosity and something close to disbelief. The hours in the waiting area passed slowly. Contestants were called one at a time and led through a set of heavy doors that muffled the sound of whatever was happening on the other side. Some came back smiling. Some came back with wet eyes and tight expressions. The atmosphere in the room shifted with each return, the way weather shifts when something is moving through. Sister Christina watched it all with attention but without anxiety. She prayed quietly, not with her eyes closed or her hands folded in any visible way, but in the interior manner she had practiced for 40 years, a steady conversation with something larger than the room she was sitting in. Sister Maria sat beside her and at one point reached over and touched her hand. She asked, in a low voice, if she was nervous. Sister Christina considered the question honestly before answering. She said she was not nervous in the way she had expected to be. She said she felt something closer to alertness, a sharpening of attention, as if her whole self were preparing to be present for something important. She said that whatever happened on that stage, she had already decided to give it everything she had, not for applause, not for judges, but because the voice she carried was not entirely her own, and it seemed wrong to offer it halfway. When her name was called, she stood up without rushing. She straightened her habit, which did not need straightening, and picked up nothing because she had brought nothing with her to the stage. Sister Maria squeezed her hand once. The production assistant led her down a long corridor with bright overhead lights and the sound of the audience growing louder with every step. At the end of the corridor, she could see the edge of the stage, the floor shining under the lights, the darkness beyond where the audience sat, and the backs of the 4 large red chairs where the judges waited, unaware of who was coming. She stood at the edge for exactly 3 seconds, then she walked out. The stage was larger than anything she had ever stood on in her life. The lights hit her from above and from the sides, and for a brief moment, the world beyond the stage disappeared entirely into a warm, bright blur. She could hear the audience before she could see them, a low collective sound of surprise that moved through the crowd like a single breath being drawn in all at once. It was not cruel or mocking. It was simply the sound of people encountering something they had not expected and not knowing yet what to make of it. She walked to the center of the stage with the same unhurried pace she had carried all day. The microphone stand waited for her there, adjusted to a height that the production team had set in advance. She stepped up to it, placed her hands lightly at her sides and looked out at the audience. Thousands of faces looked back at her, some leaning forward, some exchanging glances with the person beside them, some simply still, caught in a moment of genuine uncertainty about what was going to happen next. The four red chairs faced the opposite direction, and the four judges sitting in them knew only that someone had walked onto the stage. They had no other information. One of the show's hosts spoke her name into a microphone from the side of the stage. The announcement was simple and brief. The audience heard her name, saw her face and her habit and her silver hair, and the murmuring that followed was immediate and widespread. It was not unkind, but it was honest, and honesty in a crowd that size has its own particular sound. There were some laughs, not loud or mean, but the involuntary kind that escape people when reality surprises them. There were also people who went immediately quiet, the ones who had learned from experience or from instinct that surprises in rooms like this sometimes turn into the moments you remember for the rest of your life. Sister Christina heard all of it. She heard the murmuring and the laughter and the shifting of bodies in seats. She had known it would be something like this. She had thought about it on the drive from Montefiore and in the waiting room and in the corridor just before the stage. She had decided in advance that she would not allow what she heard in those first seconds to change anything about what she intended to do. She had come to sing. She was going to sing. The music began. The opening notes of the song filled the studio through the speakers, and the crowd began to settle. She had chosen a song that many people in Italy knew, one that carried its own emotional weight before a single word was sung. She had chosen it not for strategy, but because it was the song she felt in the deepest part of herself when she thought about what she wanted to say to a room full of strangers. She had practiced it in the chapel for weeks, not to perfect a performance, but to make sure she understood every word she was singing and meant every word she was singing. When she opened her mouth and the first note came out, the room changed. It is difficult to describe in precise terms what happens when a voice like hers enters a large space for the first time. The sound was rich and full and completely without effort. The kind of voice that does not announce itself but simply arrives and fills every corner of the room before anyone has had time to prepare. The murmuring stopped as if a switch had been thrown. The people who had been leaning toward their neighbors straightened up. The ones who had been smiling with skepticism let the smiles fade into something more serious and more open. Within the first 4 or 5 seconds, the entire audience had gone from amused uncertainty to absolute attention. The judges heard it too. Behind their red chairs, 4 of the most experienced music professionals in Italy felt the sound reach them, and one by one their bodies responded before their minds caught up. The first judge to react was a man who had spent 30 years in the music industry and who prided himself on having heard everything. His hand moved toward the button on his armrest before the first verse was even finished. He pressed it. His chair began to turn slowly and mechanically, and when he saw who was standing at the microphone, his eyes went wide and then soft in a way that several cameras caught from different angles, and that would later be replayed more times than anyone in that studio could have imagined. The second judge turned not long after, and then the third. Each time a chair rotated and a new face appeared, the audience responded with a fresh surge of sound, applause, and shouting, and the kind of collective emotion that sweeps through a crowd when something extraordinary is being witnessed together. Sister Christina kept singing through all of it. She did not break her concentration. She did not look at the judges turning to face her with expressions of open astonishment. She kept her eyes forward and her voice steady, and she gave the song everything she had told Sister Maria she intended to give it. By the time the fourth chair turned, the audience was standing. She finished the song the way she had always finished the morning hymn in the chapel, with a completeness, as if the last note were not an ending but a placing down, a careful setting of something back where it belonged. The final sound faded into the studio air, and for 1/2 second there was silence, the rarest and most valuable response a performer can receive. Silence that means the audience is still inside the song and not yet ready to leave it. Then the room erupted. The noise that followed was unlike anything the studio had produced that season. People were on their feet, their hands raised, their faces turned toward a 63-year-old nun standing in the center of a television stage in a city she had never performed in, and they were giving her everything they had. She stood in it and received it with a kind of graceful stillness, not because she was unmoved, but because the gratitude she felt in that moment was not the kind that expresses itself in jumping or tears or dramatic gestures. She pressed both hands gently to her heart and bowed her head, a small and simple movement that somehow communicated more than any larger gesture could have. The judges were talking to each other and to the cameras and to the audience, and their voices overlapped in the way voices do when a room is full of people trying to describe something they have just experienced and have not yet found the right words for. One of them said, in a voice that carried clearly over the noise, that he had been waiting his whole career to hear a voice like that come from a place he had never thought to look. Sister Christina raised her head and looked at all 4 of them. Then she smiled the smile that everyone in Montefiore knew, the one that started in her eyes before it reached her mouth. And she said thank you in a voice that was quiet enough that the crowd had to settle down just to hear it. They settled down immediately. The days that followed the audition were unlike anything Sister Christina had experienced in 63 years of living. She had returned to Montefiore the same way she had left, quietly and without announcement, in the same small car with Sister Maria beside her and the same hills appearing on the horizon as they drove back through the afternoon light. The convent received her with the familiar smell of stone and candle wax and the sound of the evening bell calling the community to prayer. She unpacked her small bag, hung her habit, and joined the other sisters in the chapel as if the day had been ordinary in every respect. But the episode had not yet aired. The production team had explained to her that there would be a period of weeks between the recording of the audition and its broadcast on national television. During that time, she was asked to keep the details of what had happened private. She agreed without difficulty. She had never been someone who needed to tell people things before the right moment, and she returned to her regular life with the ease of someone stepping back into a river they had never truly left. She taught her classes, attended her prayers, helped in the kitchen on the days when it was her turn, and carried inside herself the knowledge of what had happened in Milan the way you carry a letter you have not yet been given permission to open in front of others. The sisters who had encouraged her to audition watched her carefully during those weeks, looking for some change in her manner or her bearing, some sign of what she was feeling underneath the surface of her ordinary days. They found very little to read. She was warm and present and occasionally funny in the dry, quiet way she had always been funny. And if something larger was moving through her interior life, she kept it where she had always kept the things that mattered most to her, deep and unhurried and entirely her own. When the broadcast date was finally announced, word spread through the convent, and then through the town with the particular speed that news travels in small communities, where everyone's life is connected to everyone else's. The woman who ran the bakery near the church square told her customers. The schoolchildren heard it from their parents and came to class the next morning looking at Sister Christina with new eyes, the kind of wide and wondering eyes that children get when someone familiar suddenly becomes mysterious. She treated their curiosity with gentle humor, telling them that whatever they were expecting, they should perhaps prepare themselves for disappointment, and then smiling in a way that suggested she was not entirely serious. The night the episode aired, the convent gathered in the small common room where a television had been set up against one wall. It was not a large television, and the room was not large either, and the sisters arranged themselves on chairs and on the edges of tables, and in the doorway because there were more of them than the room comfortably held. Some of the older sisters had brought their reading glasses. One had brought her knitting, and then set it down in her lap untouched the moment the program began. Sister Maria sat directly beside Sister Christina and did not look at the television at all for the first several minutes, but instead watched the face of the woman next to her. When Sister Christina appeared on the screen, walking out onto that bright stage in her habit with her silver hair and her unhurried step, the room went very quiet. The sisters watched themselves watching her, aware that they were seeing something that millions of other people across Italy were seeing at exactly the same moment, in living rooms and restaurants and bars where the television had been turned up and the conversation had stopped. They heard the audience murmur. They heard the uncertain laughter. A few of the younger sisters shifted in their seats with a discomfort that came from protectiveness, the instinct to shield someone you love from being misunderstood. Then the music began, and then the voice came out of the small television speaker, and the room in the convent did what the room in the studio had done. It went absolutely still. Watching yourself sing is a strange experience for anyone. For Sister Christina it was stranger still, because she had never seen herself perform, had never stood in front of a mirror and rehearsed with any attention to what she looked like from the outside. What she saw on the screen was a woman she recognized and did not entirely recognize, standing in a river of light with a stillness that looked, from the outside, like something she had not realized she possessed. She watched the first judge's hand move toward the button, she watched the chair begin to turn, she heard the audience surge. And she felt, sitting in that small room surrounded by the women who were her family, something that she would later describe to Sister Maria in private as a complex feeling. Not pride exactly, but something adjacent to it. A kind of quiet gratitude that the thing she had carried inside her for 60 years had been seen, finally, by more than the walls of a chapel. By the time the fourth chair had turned on the screen, several of the sisters in the room were crying. Not with sadness, but with the particular emotion that arrives when you witness someone you love being recognized in the way you have always believed they deserved to be recognized. The young sister who had first shown Sister Christina the program on her tablet was holding both hands over her mouth. The sister who had brought her knitting had not touched it. Sister Maria was still watching Sister Christina's face rather than the screen, and what she saw there was something she kept to herself for a long time afterward, only describing it much later as the expression of a person who has set something down after carrying it for a very long time. The phones began that night. The convent's main line rang within minutes of the broadcast ending, and it rang again and again through the evening until someone made the decision to let it go to the answering machine, where messages accumulated through the night in Italian and then in other languages as the clip of the audition began its journey across the internet. Journalists called, television programs called. People who had seen the broadcast called simply to say that they had been moved and wanted someone connected to her to know it. A woman called from a town 200 kilometers away to say that her husband, who had not spoken much since losing his job the previous year, had watched the audition and then turned to her and said something kind for the first time in months, and she needed someone to know that. Sister Christina did not hear most of these messages until the following morning. She had gone to bed at her regular time, because the chapel bells would ring at dawn as they always did, and the day would begin as it always began, and she was not the kind of person who allowed extraordinary circumstances to disrupt the structures that held her life in order. She slept, as Sister Maria reported to the others with a kind of amused wonder, without apparent difficulty. In the morning she rose before the bells, as was her habit, and went to the chapel while the sky outside was still dark. She sat in the pew she had sat in for decades, in the particular silence that exists just before a community wakes, and she prayed in the interior way that was as natural to her as breathing. She prayed with gratitude and with a question that she had been sitting with since the night in Milan, a sincere and unhurried inquiry into what she was supposed to do now, what it meant that the world had heard her, and what responsibility came with being heard by that many people at once. She did not receive an answer in the form of words or certainty. She rarely did. What she received was the same thing she had always received in that pew in that chapel in that small town in the hills, a sense of direction that was less like a road and more like a current, something that did not tell her exactly where she was going but made it clear that moving forward was right and that she would not be moving alone. When the bells rang and the sisters began to arrive for morning prayer, she was already in her place, sitting straight and calm, her hands folded, her eyes forward. They filed in around her and the chapel filled with the sound of gathered breath and rustling fabric and then the opening notes of the morning hymn. She opened her mouth and sang, the way she had sung every morning for 40 years, as if the world were listening, because now, in a way it had not been before, the world actually was. It had not been before, the world actually was. The world that Sister Christina returned to after the broadcast was the same world she had always lived in, and yet something in it had shifted in a way that could not be undone. The convent walls were the same stone, the chapel smelled the same. The bells still rang 7 times at dawn. But her phone, which she rarely used, had been placed in the hands of Sister Maria for safekeeping, because it had not stopped receiving messages since the night the episode aired. Letters arrived at the convent, addressed simply to the singing nun from Italy, with no street name and no postal code. And they arrived in numbers that made the local postman shake his head slowly each morning as he unloaded his bag. The video of her audition had traveled across the internet in the way only certain things do. Not because someone pushed it, but because people kept sending it to other people who they felt needed to see it. A daughter sent it to her elderly mother in a care home in Portugal. A teacher shared it with a classroom of teenagers in South Korea who watched it on a projector screen and went completely silent. A man in Brazil who had been sitting alone in his apartment on a difficult night found it by accident at 2 in the morning, and later wrote to the convent saying that it had changed the direction of his entire evening, and perhaps more than that. The video crossed languages and borders and generations, and reached people who had no particular interest in singing competitions and no particular connection to faith. And it reached them anyway and left a mark. Sister Christina received all of this information gradually and with the particular kind of care she brought to most things in her life. She read the letters that were shared with her. She heard the stories. She sat with them the way she sat with difficult prayers, not rushing toward a conclusion, but allowing the full weight of each one to settle before moving to the next. What moved her most was not the scale of the response but its texture, the specificity of the people who had been touched, the particular moments in particular lives when the sound of her voice had found someone in a room somewhere, and had meant something to them that she could not have planned or predicted. The show itself continued, and she continued with it. Each subsequent performance brought new pressure and new attention, and the Italian public followed her journey with an investment that surprised even the show's producers. She was not the youngest contestant or the most technically trained. She was not the most polished performer in terms of stage presence or choreography. But she had something that resisted easy description, a quality of absolute sincerity that communicated itself through the screen and made people feel that what they were watching was real in a way that entertainment is not always real. They were not watching someone trying to become a star. They were watching someone who had spent 40 years learning how to be present and who was now simply being present on a very large stage. There were critics, as there are always critics. Some wrote that the show was exploiting her novelty. Some suggested that her success was more about spectacle than talent, that people were responding to the image of a nun on a stage rather than to the voice itself. She read some of these assessments and considered them without defensiveness. She acknowledged that there was something undeniably striking about the image she presented. She never claimed otherwise. But she also knew what she heard in the chapel every morning, what the children in her parish school had heard for decades, and what 40,000 people in a television studio had gone silent for, and she trusted that knowledge without needing to argue it with anyone. She did not win the competition. The finale came in early summer, and she finished in a position that was not first, and she accepted that outcome with the same equanimity she had brought to everything else. There was no visible disappointment, no manufactured grace in the face of loss. She simply understood, in the way she understood most things, that winning had never been the point. The point had been the singing, and the singing had happened, fully and without reservation, every single time she stepped onto that stage. What came after was not the career that competition shows typically produce. She did not sign immediately with a major label and release a pop album. She did not hire a manager and begin touring arenas. What she did was return to Montefiore, to the convent and the chapel and the children and the work that had always defined her days. She continued to sing every morning and every evening with the other sisters, in the same room where she had sung for decades. And the sound that filled that room was no different from the sound that had filled a television studio and traveled across the world through a small screen. But the world had found her, and it was not entirely willing to let go. A recording opportunity came that felt right, one that allowed her to make music on her own terms and in service of something larger than fame. She recorded an album that contained the kinds of songs she had always loved. Music with depth and feeling, and the particular quality of meaning something beyond what it literally said. It sold in numbers that surprised everyone except perhaps Sister Maria, who had always known exactly what she was accompanying on that drive to Milan. She was invited to perform in places she had never imagined standing, large concert halls in European cities, a private event at the Vatican, a benefit concert in Rome where the audience included people whose names she recognized from the news and who stood to applaud her the same way the studio audience had stood on that first night. She brought to each of these occasions the same thing she had always brought to the chapel, not performance, not spectacle, but the genuine offering of something she believed she had been given and therefore had a responsibility to share. The children in her parish grew up hearing the story of what she had done, and some of them carried it in the way children carry stories that mean something to them, privately and for a long time. There was a girl in one of her classes who had always been told her own voice was nothing special, who sat in the back of the room and never raised her hand during music lessons. After watching Sister Christina on television, that girl began singing quietly to herself in the hallway, and then less quietly, and then in front of others, and eventually in front of a small audience at a school event where her teacher stood in the back of the room with full eyes and thought about the particular way one person's courage can unlock something in another person that no instruction ever could. Sister Christina did not know about that girl for a long time. When she finally heard the story, she sat with it for a long moment in the way she sat with all the things that mattered most to her. Then she said that this, more than any chair turning or any standing ovation or any number of views on a video, was what she would carry with her when she thought about what had happened in that studio in Milan on an ordinary spring day when she had simply decided to walk out onto a stage and sing. She said that a voice is not something you own. It is something you are given, and the only honest thing to do with it is to give it back. Like, share, and subscribe, don't miss it.